Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the final session in the series, What Does the Divine Image Look Like? This class examines the central position of the divine image in the Jewish commandment of burial. It will also consider some of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' teachings on the divine image, paying tribute to him upon his recent passing. We encourage you to ask questions either by unmuting yourself or by writing them in the chat box on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. And now, without delay, I'll turn this to Rabbi Zuckier.
Right. Hi, everyone. It's good to have a chance to learn together. As Evie said, well, I'd welcome everyone sharing their screens if they're comfortable. And also to echo what Evie said, the original plan was to focus on the mitzvah of burial, which we will do. But given the passing of Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sachs over the weekend, I thought it might make sense to share a little bit of his teachings about the divine image, which something he wrote about a lot and which intersects with what we've discussed over the past few weeks by way of summation of our topic. So that's the plan for today. So we'll jump in, and I'm going to share the handout is found in the chat. I'm also going to share screen so that we can sort of follow together. We're going to try to trace the theme of Tselem Elokim, of the divine image, as part of the mitzvah of burial. And there's a lot more. We're not going to fully cover this topic. It's really a huge question on how to interpret the psukim that we're going to look at. That biblical interpretation question is a very complex one, but we're going to focus on some aspects of it, especially those that relate to the divine image. That's what we'll start with. And it begins with a couple of psukim in Parshas Kiseitze, which I guess we read not too long ago on the other side of Bereshis. So source number one here, you should see on the screen, very short little passage, two psukim. If a person has committed a sin that they're deserving of death and they're killed, so you should hang them on a tree. Notice the order here. It sounds like the person is dead first, and then they're hanged on the tree. We'll see Chazal talk about that in a second. Lo salin nivlasa'alaitz. You shouldn't, lehalin means to have something sleep, have something stay the night. You shouldn't have his body stay the night on the tree. Ki kavor tikverenu bayomahu. Rather, you should bury the body on that very day. Why? This is the key phrase. Ki kilalas elokim talui. Because a curse of God is hanging. And it's not exactly what that means, but that's the reason, it seems. The reason why you should bury this body of this criminal who was hanged who was given the death penalty and then hanged. You should bury them before evening because a curse of God is hanging. And this sounds like maybe a second reason. You shouldn't defile the land that Hashem your God is giving you as an inheritance. So we're going to try to figure out exactly what the second reason is pretty clear, although it seems to be secondary. This idea of not defiling the land, not having the body out overnight defiles the land. Fine, that means what it means, but it seems like the main reason is ki kilalas elokim talui. The curse of God is hanging if you leave this person up on the tree overnight, and that's why you should try to bury, or you have to bury the body before nightfall. And we're going to, aside from interpreting the reason here, it's also worth noting at the outset that this is the main source. This is the basis of the Jewish obligation to bury bodies, period, but especially to bury them soon. In America, we're not necessarily as stringent about this as we are elsewhere in the world, but certainly in many places in Israel, the minhag is to make every effort to bury the body as soon as possible, especially before nightfall, if that's at all possible. And we're going to see that also comes back, that stems from this pasuk. So we're going to try to figure out what this pasuk means and how it might relate to the divine image. We start with Targum Onkelos, right? Onkelos is translation of the Torah into Aramaic, and he says, "Lo savisni v'asei al tzliva." Don't let the body remain on the tzliva. He says not on a tree. He translates eitz as tzliva. Tzliva means a cross. So there's a whole discussion as to what Onkelos is assuming, and this idea of hanging on a cross as opposed to hanging on a tree. because Pshat and Chumash, it seems like hangings happened on trees, not on crosses. We know from the Roman period, in some famous cases, that hangings happened on crosses. So Unkelus is talking about a cross, but let's put that question aside. There's all other discussion to be had there. Rather, you should bury him on that day. Why? Because for something for which he sinned before God, he was hanged. He was hanged for the fact that he sinned before God. And you shouldn't defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. That's all the same as the Hebrew. So the key line here is because he sinned, he sinned before God, and that's the reason why he was hanged. So if you read it like Unkelus, the straightforward meaning is whatever this person's crime was, and we'll get to that in a bit. Whatever their crime was, they sinned against God. They did something wrong against God, and you wouldn't want to hang someone like that. Maybe it's a reminder to everyone of the person's sin, right? The goal of hanging people is, on the one hand, is a deterrent, right? One of the factors is you hang someone, you say this is right. This is what happens to people who commit crimes. There's a deterrent effect. At the same time, it seems that Unkelus is pointing to the idea that you're also normalizing violation of that directive, right? If every day someone sees someone hanging and they know, oh, they must have violated this and that law, that shows that a lot of people are violating the law, and that normalizes it. So maybe there's a bit of a balance here in Unkelus. On the one hand, you want to publicize that a person violated the law in this way. On the other hand, there's for deterrent purposes. On the other hand, you don't want it to become too normalized. That might be Unkelus. That doesn't directly touch on our purposes, but contrast that with Targum Yonasan, also known as pseudo-Jonathan translation, not actually by Yonasan, different discussion another time. He writes as follows. He translates as follows: Lo savis nivlas gushmei al kesa, right? Don't leave the body or the dead body of his corpse on the tree. Arum mikabar tikabarune biomahu. Rather, you should bury it that day. Why? This is the key phrase. Arum kilusa kadam elaka limitzlov yivar. Because it's a kilusa, it's a denigration before God, or it's a denigration of God to hang a person. So that already is striking. What is this idea that it's a denigration of God to hang a person? Why would that be the case? Elahain chovai garmule. In this case, we make an exception. We hang this person because their sins caused them to deserve it. But still, it goes against our usual approach, which is that it's an embarrassment to God. It's a denigration of God to hang a person. Umin biglal tibidyukna dashem is avad tikaberune im mitmo shimsha. And because he's in the image of God, dyukna is image, right? He used the term dyukna there. If you remember, Targum Yonasan used that term to refer to being in the image of God. Because this person was created in the image of God, you have to bury him as the sun goes down. You have to bury him before sunset. Why? Delo yekilin biryasabe. So people shouldn't make light of him. Right? They shouldn't denigrate. They shouldn't make light of this person who is now hanged, and maybe also God. Right? It's sort of ambiguous. People shouldn't make light of him. Is him the person who's hanged, or is him God, or maybe both? And don't defile with this body the land that God is giving you as an inheritance. So we see here a fascinating reading in Targum Yonasan. We're going to see it elsewhere in different interpretations and Chazals. But for now, this idea that it's a denigration of God to hang a person. We make an exception for certain people who commit certain crimes, but we have to take it down as soon as possible in order, because people are in the divine image, and in order that people not make light of him, the person who's hanged, or make light of God. And notice this term, right, we have in the pasuk kilalas elokim talui. And what exactly klala means? A curse. How do we understand it? So at first, it seems like it's translated twice in Targum Yonasan here. Number one, kilusa, to make light, to denigrate, and then number two, dela yekilin. Again, similar meaning, but with a different deployed for a different purpose. That people not make light. So this idea that God it's a denigration of God to hang a person, and we don't want people denigrating God when they see a person who's hanged. And it directly invokes this idea of Tzelem Elokim, that people are created in the divine image. Even this criminal, this person who did these terrible things, and you're going to hang them because of their crimes. Still, the fact is that this person is in the divine image, and we need to give them that respect. We have to take down the body before it's night and bury them. So this is the first invocation of Tzelem Elokim here in the Targum Yonasan in a very strong formulation. Pause now in case there are any questions. I see there's something. Okay, it's just a handout in the chat. Any questions? Anyone want to discuss the Targum here, or just the Psukim themselves? There's really a lot to discuss. We're only going to get to some of it, but any preliminary thoughts on what we've done so far? Okay, if not, well, let's go forward. Let's move. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi we're going to see is channeling Chazal here. Rashi explains, Ki kilalas elokim talui, right? This key phrase, a curse of God is hanging. And just if you want to be a little bit semantic here, if you want to argue about semantics, as interpreting Bible often entails, so there's what we call the subject versus object genitive. Or in layman's terms, when you say a curse of God, does that mean someone who's cursed by God? Or does that mean someone who's a situation where someone's cursing God? Right? A curse of God, meaning is the curse coming from God, or is the curse being directed at God? That is ambiguous. You could read it either way. So, so far we've mainly seen the approach. So far in Targum Yonasan, and we're going to see this in Rashi too. It's the idea of being a curse of God. This is not necessarily the simplest reading, but let's see Rashi. Ki kilalas elokim talui. Rashi says zilzulo shel melechu. It's a denigration, not exactly a curse, but similar. It's a denigration of God, meaning it's a curse of God, meaning God is the one who's getting cursed here. How so? She'adam asui b'dmus diukno. A person is created in God's image. Dmus diukno, right? B'tzelem elokim and the b'dmus elokim. So you have dmus, you have diukon. This is the image and form of God. V'Yisrael heim banav. So people are in the divine image, and the Jewish people are God's children. What is this? What's Rashi saying with this double formulation here? It sounds like there's two different levels. What does this echo? So on the one hand, he's saying all people are in God's image, and on top of that, Yisrael, the Jewish people, are God's children. They're sort of an additional level. Rashi here may be channeling. Rashi here may be channeling the Mishnah and Avos. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem, and then Chaviv in Yisrael Shenikorim Banim Lamakom. Right? It sounds like Rashi's channeling that idea. There's two different levels here. All humans are in the divine image. The Jewish people are the children of God. There's somehow this extra level, the super level of being having this extra resemblance or extra connection to God that Rashi seems to be bringing in here. And this is how he spells it out with this mashal that comes from Chazal, but it's really a powerful one, right? This parable. Mashal l'shnei achim. It's like two brothers, ta'omim, two twin brothers, and I would say maybe even two identical twin brothers. Shahayu domin zelazeh, right? Sounds like they're identical. Echad nasa melech, ve'echad nispas listios v'nisla. Right? They had they diverged. Their fates diverged. One of them became the king. The other one was a prolific robber and was caught and was then hanged. He got the death penalty. He was hanged for being a robber. So what happens in this scenario, right? This person is an identical twin of the king. Kol also, Omer HaMelech Talui. Everyone who sees them says, look, the person who's hanging here in the town square is the king. He looks identical to the king. It is the king. So that's the mashal here. That's the idea here, because all humans are in the divine image. Jews are even more so. They're God's children, so to speak. So it's just like you have identical twins. One of them is hanged. The other one's the king. It's a denigration of the king to leave this twin, the criminal twin, up. And then Rashi explains, "Kol klal shebemikra lashon hakel v'zilzul." Anytime it talks about a klala, it's not only a curse; it's also denigration. But this powerful idea here in Rashi, again, building on the idea of Tzelem Elokim, all humans are in the divine image. Jews are even more so, if that's possible, and therefore leaving anyone up leaving, and especially a criminal, you're having people denigrate God. It's a denigration of God to leave him up because this person is identical. They look identical to God. A very powerful idea in Rashi. Now, not all interpreters take this same approach. There's a few different ways to interpret differently. One way is to explain the term Elokim differently. The way Rashi and Targum Yonasan understood it, Kikilas Elokim Talui, it's a curse of God. People will denigrate God if they see this person who's in the image of God hanging. We'll see Rashbam takes a different approach. It says Kikilas Elokim Talui. Rashbam says, people see this person hanging, who are they going to curse? Not God, they're going to curse the judges. The term Elohim can refer to judges, not only to God. They're going to curse the judges, O Krovim Shel Harug, O Shar Bnei Adam, either the relatives of the deceased or whoever is going to curse the judges. Lefif Shepa'amim, Alavera Mu'etes, Hunera Kmo Makoshe. Sometimes people get the death penalty for a minor violation. They think they shouldn't deserve it. Like Baruch Hu Amar, Elokim Lo Sekalel, or Elohim Lo Sekalel. The Torah says you shouldn't curse judges. That's what we're worried about. So Kilasem Talui, the longer you leave them up, the longer people are going to denigrate. You're going to curse the judges. You should take them down as soon as possible. That's a very different approach that has nothing to do with Tselem Elokim, nothing to do with Elokim at all, nothing to do with God. It has to do with Elohim, it has to do with judges. That's one way out. The Chizkuni has a different approach here. He says, "Lo sanit lin v'asal eitzel kavar tikurenu bo bayom atzmo shenisli you bury in the day of shelo yomru haroim bino shel megadef b'tzliya b'shem ezem megadef hayev ignai hulamel." So this first approach seems to be what we saw in Onkelos with a certain twist, where he explains the words ki kilalas elokim talui as saying the person who is hanged is a person who is cursing God. What does that mean? It means that that's why they're hanging. The reason why they're hanging, their crime was to curse God. So ki kilalas elokim talui, the person who's hanging is a kilalas elokim, is a cursor, is a person who cursed God. The more you leave that person up, the more people remember and are reminded of the fact that someone cursed God, which is a denigration of God, a very different approach. Another interpretation. Yomru imhekel b'mitzvos kadosh baruch hu kfar natal b'misa as shalom v'dailo b'mashanisla. Or people will say, whatever this person's crime is, they're dead now. They already got their punishment, and they shouldn't deserve any more punishment. So people are going to think that maybe this person exhausted their punishment, which is not true. We believe that there's punishment in the afterlife as well. So that's what the Chizkuni is pointing out there. And then the third interpretation, davar acher, la dayanim kai im yamod ala eitz ve'ovrim sham yiruhu bal parts of v'komo pamim yu svurim shal ve'rakala nidam yikalas dayanim shetinu lisli. The same as the Rashbam said. People are going to curse the judges. It's not talking about God. It's talking about cursing judges. There are other interpretations here, but I think other ways of reading Elokim, different ways of reading Kilalas, this idea of the curse of God, and we'll see some more when we see the Chazal earlier sources. But I think the most powerful and maybe the most important interpretation is the one that we saw in Targum Yonasan and in Rashi. And we'll see there's a variation of this approach in the Sforno here in source number 7 that will tie into some things that we've seen in previous weeks. Before we get to that, though, again, I wanted to ask if anyone had any questions, or anyone wanted to discuss any of the sources, or you can put a question in the chat, or do it verbally. Feel free to turn on your videos if we have any questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you think there's something specific in hanging that it sort of gets this focal point? And I guess I'm thinking of like, we do stone people as part of the death penalty in Jewish law. And I also was thinking in 2 Samuel 21, we have the people who are impaled for crimes that were committed like before their generation. And I guess I'm wondering if hanging has some kind of like, I'm almost wondering if it's because you can still see the likeness of a person, but it's distorted or something like that. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, interesting. So first, we'll see this in a few minutes in Chazal. The idea there's a connection between being stoned and being hanged. So the way the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, kol ha-niskalim nislim. All the people who get the stoning also get hanged, according to one opinion. If not, it's a subset of them. So there is this connection, and I think we see in stoning as well, there are certain moves that Chazal make to preserve the divine image. But I think the larger point we're going to see is that this is not really limited to stoning. It's really going to be a broader idea that all people should be buried before nightfall. Again, that's sort of honored in the breach in the US, but in some communities, they're very stringent about actually burying people before nightfall. And I think the reason why it comes up here is because it's like the opposite extreme, meaning in the case of hanging someone, you are in some ways hurting their divine image, or whatever that means, right? You are hanging them, putting them on display, this dead body, and you might think, okay, well, in that case, in that scenario, we're not concerned with Tzelem Elokim in that way, and that's why the pasuk needs to say, no, even here, maybe especially here, we need to actually think about Tzelem Elokim and burial, but of course, that same principle would apply everywhere else. So I think that's why this case is special. I think we saw that in Targum Yonasan, the idea that, right, that usually we wouldn't want to hang anyone at all. Here, this person's sins, right, caused them to be hanged. But even so, you absolutely can't hang them until nightfall. You need to take them down before then. And we'll see in the Mishnah, the Mishnah's ideal understanding is that really the person is only hanged for a minimal amount of time to minimize any such denigration at all. Okay, any other questions or thoughts, reflections? All right, so let's jump back in. Let's jump back in with the next source, the Sforno here. And the Sforno, I think, is going to be a version, like a sort of variant of the Tzelem Elokim idea. So he says, Ki kilalas Elokim talui, this curse of God is hanging. Hine kol etzem nivdal mechomer yikare Elokim. This, right, the term Elokim doesn't just refer to God, it refers to anything that's some existence that's disconnected from material, some immaterial existence, that's called Elokim. Umizeh hamin hu etzem hanefesh hasichlis ba'adam hanikres Tzelem Elokim. You know what the best example of that is? Or at least one example is the human soul, the intellectual human soul, which is the Tzelem Elokim. So again, we saw this, I think the Sforno himself said this when we were studying what is Tzelem Elokim. One understanding is it's your mind, the human mind. That's the one way in which humans are similar, at least at some level, similar to God. We have the capacity to think. That's not a physical thing. That's a spiritual thing, the intellectual capacity, and that's our divine image. So Ki kilalas Elokim talui means the kilalas Elokim, it's a curse to this divine image. It's a curse to this person's personhood, to their intellect, to their divine quality that they're hanging, and that's why you should take them down. So this is almost assuming that Tzelem Elokim, instead of like Rashi and Targum Yonasan, who say, no, it's actually cursing God, leave them up here, it's saying, well, no, it's cursing their Tzelem Elokim. It's shifting the language of it, but it's the same basic idea. Amra, Balas, O, Vishala, Elokim, Ra'isi Olim, etc. Fine. Uviyosha, Bizayim, Hanasal, Ames, Achar, Misa, who Bizayim, Lenefesh, Sichlis, Ashari, Etzem, Nivdal, Hanishar, Achar, Misa, Zaguf. So after death, he needs to make certain assumptions, right? If you assume the soul leaves the body right after death, then this wouldn't really be relevant. So he's saying, no, the soul remains in some form in the body after death, such that leaving the body up is actually denigrating the human intellect / soul. That divine aspect of humanity called God, which is the human intellect, that is what's denigrated by the body decomposing publicly. But that's the Sforno as well. So he takes this idea that's about Tzelem Elokim, and he says that he's not saying it's a denigration to God directly, it's a denigration to the Tzelem Elokim of the person who's hanging. So again, a variation, but you get to a similar point to what Rashi and the Targum Yonasan got to. Let's move now to Chazal, a few different sources among Chazal from the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the Sifrei, all of which touch on this. And we could spend a lot more time. There's really a few different block Gemara, a few different pages of Gemara that focus on this issue. But we're only going to have a sampling of it now, and then we're going to spend the last few minutes thinking about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, some of his teachings on this topic. So Mishnah and Sanhedrin. So this is the line I mentioned to Zoe before. Kol niskalim nislin, right? All of those who are hanged, all those who get skila, who get stoned, get hanged. That's sort of after they get killed through the process of skila, they then get hanged publicly. So that's his opinion. The only two people who get hanged are the Megadef, the person who curses God, and one who worships idolatry. Only they get hanged. Can anyone guess why those two would be the only two to qualify for getting hanged? What's special about them in this context? So we're going to see this. It's this idea of Ki kilalas Elokim talui that we already saw in one of the Mefarshim, the idea of the cursing of God is hanging, a curse of God is hanging, meaning a person who cursed God is hanging. And it learns out from that, we're going to see the Gemara learns out from that, that only those who curse God, whether directly through cursing God or through worshiping idolatry, which is a form of cursing God, only they get hanged. That's the interesting reading. So that's the opinion of the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer, on the other hand, says all of those who get stoned get hanged. Fine. Continue in the Mishnah. Ha'ish, also panav klape ha'am, va'isha panea klape ha'etz. Find different ways of hanging men and women. Rabbi Eliezer. Chachamim ha'ish nisla ve'ena isha nisles. Chachamim say no, only men get hanged and not women. Why? Because the pasuk says v'chiyeh be'ish mishpat mavis umas. If a man has the death penalty and gets killed, then you hang him, but not a woman. That's the way the Chachamim read it. So that's interesting too. And one way you might think of that is maybe for some reason the denigration of the Tzelem Elokim is greater for women in this context than for men, and maybe that's why it's not even viable, right? You don't even hang women for that reason, arguably. And I'll just note what probably many of us are thinking. It's we live in a world where death penalties are not too common, and they're certainly not too public. The world that Chazal we're in is a different sort of world, so it may take a little adjusting to enter the exact mind space of Chazal. But that's what we're trying to do here, and trying to draw out some of the principles that Chazal have. Fine, and then there's all discussion about Shimon ben Shetach giving the death penalty to women and whether his whole process was proper or not. Fine, let's jump to here. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi says, Hakora, the pole, the tree that the person's hanged on, Muta al hakosel, it's sort of leaning on a wall. I'm sorry, we should go back to here. Ketzad tolin also, right? How does the hanging process work? Meshakin is a korah ba'aretz. You sort of stick a big beam in the ground. Ve'etz yotze mimena, and there's a little piece of wood sticking out. So it's like a gamma shape. I don't know. It's a straight line with something sticking out of it. And the person puts their hands one on top of the other. So when you hang them on this piece of wood, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Hakora muta ala kosel v'tolos u'kderech she'atabachnos. And Rabbi Yossi thinks you lean the beam on the wall. But listen to this. I mentioned this to Zoe before. Umatirin oso miyad. You put the person up, you hang them, and then you immediately take them down. You immediately untie them. Right? That's very odd. You hang them and then immediately unhang them. If the person stays overnight, over love below sase, there's a negative prohibition. It's usher to let the person stay overnight. Shenemar lo salin lo saleit. The pasuk says, don't leave their body on the tree. Kikavar tikvarenu, but you should rather bury them. Kikalas elokim talui, because a curse of God is hanging. Vigomer. Klomar. And now here's going to be one interpretation of this Mishnah that will explain what we saw at the beginning. Why is this person hanging? Because they blessed or cursed God, right? The reason why they're hanging is because they cursed God. That's what people will assume when they see this person hanging, and maybe for good reason. If you only hang people who either cursed God or did avodah zarah, so then people would rightfully think a person hanging cursed God, and you're thereby denigrating God's name, because people will remember that this person cursed God, right? Not part of the problem of blasphemy is not just that the person who says it defames God, but that the fact of the defamation of God getting out means that everyone in some ways now sees God's name impugned in some way. So this reading of the Mishnah is a different understanding of kikilas elokim talui, right? It's not saying that the very fact that a person is hanging is a curse of God. No, it's only if the person who's hanging is associated with cursing God, meaning that that's what they did. That was their sin, to curse God. That's the denigration of God. So this is a different reading of kikilas elokim talui by the Mishnah, although we're going to see they're not mutually exclusive. You can have multiple understandings of kikilas elokim talui, this idea of God, a cursor of God hanging. That can both teach us that the person who gets the punishment of hanging is someone who cursed God, and also that anytime a person is hanging, that comprises an affront to God. So that's the Mishnah, and I see there's a question. There's a question based on the Sforno. I think it was a Sforno. How long is the soul attached to the body, or what percent of the soul is attached? How does that affect Tchias HaMesim when the people are revived? So this is a big question that's discussed by various achronim and philosophers. I don't know if we need to resolve the question here. It's clear that there's some connection, at least until the body decomposes. And the general view, I think, is that at Tchias HaMesim, at least one of the bodies that a soul had, if souls have more than one body, at least one such body will be reconnected with the soul. How that works, whether it's the same physical material or not, is a whole debate. So we're not going to get into the details of that. But yeah, it seems that there remains a connection between the body and the soul, according to Sforno, right afterwards, and maybe presumably until the body decomposes. At least some aspects of the soul, right? The intellectual parts of the soul. Any other questions on what we saw in the Mishnah or anything else? Okay, if not, then we'll jump back in to the sources, and we saw the Mishnah. Okay, we saw the Mishnah. Let's take a look at a few. We'll see one line in the Gemara, and then we'll see a bunch of lines in the Sifrei. I think all of which are also quoted by the Gemara, but it's sort of more efficient to quote the Sifrei. So this line, source number 10, the line from the Gemara that also appears in the Tosefta, a line that I think is the source for the invocation of Tzelem Elokim in this context. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, what's going on when the person is hanged? B'shasha adam mitzta'er. When this person who's in well, he says this more generally, but it's with application to our case. When a person is in pain, Shechina ma lashon omeres. What does the Shechina say? What does the divine presence say when a person is in pain? The Shechina says, Kalani miroshi, Kalani mizroi. I'm feeling light, or I'm feeling heavy. Maybe it's sort of a euphemism. I'm feeling heavy in my head. I'm feeling a pain in my head. I'm feeling a pain in my arm. Right? When a person is hanging, right? Remember, the hanging is you sort of hang by your arms. When this is happening, the Shechina says, I am in pain at my head and my arms. The head, presumably, because the blood leaves the head. The arms, because of where they're positioned. Wow, right? That's the way the Shechina feels when a person is hanging. This is why we try to avoid hanging people, and we take them down as soon as possible, says Rabbi Meir. Very powerful line. Im kain, hamako mitzta'er, al daman shel rishayim shenishbach. If this is true, and this is the case, what's the Mishnah talking about? It's talking about a Rasha, someone who committed some major violation. Shenishbach, daman shenishbach. He's already dead. This person is a sinner who's already dead, and still the Shechina, or the omnipresent God, in some way, Haviyachol, whatever it means, God is in pain by the fact that this person is hanging. All the more so, the blood of the righteous, and I would add the blood of the righteous who are still alive. God obviously feels even more pain when they're in pain. They didn't just say that, Ella. And this answers Zoe's question from before. It's not just about a person who's hanged, where their body is positioned in a way that they seem to be in pain and the Shekhinah is pain. No, it's even broader than that. Whoever leaves a body overnight and doesn't bury it, over below sase violates the prohibition of lo salin devas ala eitz. Don't leave the body on the tree, rather bury it. They violate that prohibition. Right, so this is a super powerful line from Rabbi Meir. He doesn't say the words Tzelem Elokim, but it seems pretty clear. Certainly Rashi and Targum Yonasan and others took it to mean that God, it's not just that there's some resemblance in the facial features, but it's almost like God participates in the pain of people who are even a Rasha who's already dead. The Shechina, so to speak, participates in their pain. It feels heavy-headed, and he feels heaviness in their arms when this person is hanging. That's why we take them down right away. Presumably, there's this deep connection, not only appearance, not only some external thing, but God actually feels kaviyachol. God feels the pain of those who are hanging. I didn't put this on the sheet, but there's another Gemara, maybe a bit over 10 blot later, that says whoever slaps a person's face, I think maybe it says a Yisrael's face, it's as if they slap the face of the Shechina. That same concept, that you hit a person, you're actually in some way hitting God as well. So this, I think, is maybe the cornerstone, the key of this aspect of Tzelem Elokim in this teaching. Let's turn now to the Sifrei. The Sifrei is the Medrash Halacha on these psukim. And every line here is quoted in the Gemara as well. It's just a bit more efficient, a bit more compact to quote these lines in the Sifrei. Okay, so let's jump in. Source 11. If a person has a sin and they get the death penalty, get killed, and it has a discussion about the Chachamim say a man gets hanged and not a woman. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and they have their whole history there. Fine, we saw that basically already. Bisalisa also, right? You hang them. And then the question is, who do you hang? Yachli, you call in Niskal and Nislin. You might think everyone who gets stoned gets hanged. No, it's only when there's a curse, someone cursing God, then they get hanged. Fine, then we have a question of how much to learn it out from there and how many people get hanged. Fine, that piece as well. But now let's turn to this. This is the key halakhic conclusion to draw from here. How do I know that anyone who leaves a body overnight violates a negative prohibition, violates a lo saseh? Talmud Omar, lo salin ivlas al eitz. Don't leave the body on the tree. And now there may be some exceptions. Helina lechvodo. What if you leave the person overnight for their own honor? Lahavi lo aron v'tachrichim. Let's say there's no aron, there's no what do you call it? There's no aron tachrichim, there's no burial shrouds, and there's no coffin to bury the person in. So you want to leave them, you want to leave the body a bit longer so you can have the proper materials, the shrouds and coffin to bury them in. Over. If you're leaving the person without burying them for their own honor, then there's more room for this. And this is the basis of nowadays of often taking longer, because we have, there are ways of keeping the body from decomposing through refrigeration, and you want to have relatives come to the funeral and that sort of thing. So that's why we're more lenient nowadays in some places based on that line. There's a negative, there's a prohibition not to leave the body on a tree. There's also a positive commandment to bury the body. What do you do? Listen to this. You wait until it's almost dark. And you hang the body. Also, when you immediately untie it, and if you leave it over overnight, you violate the prohibition. The Gemara adds you actually would have two different people. One person was in charge of hanging the body. The other person was in charge of immediately taking it down. Why? So you don't want the person to forget. You don't want to have any risk that this person's so focused on putting up the body they won't take it down. You have a different person whose sole job it is to take down the body immediately afterwards. So we see here considerations of, it seems, of Tzelem Elokim, and certainly of God being embarrassed one way or another by this body being hanged, affect the din of Tliya, right? The Torah is very clear. It says you should hang this person. And yet that's minimized to the point where you put it up for a split second, take it down immediately, and if you don't, and you leave it overnight, you violate a big avera. So we see that this consideration of Tzelem Elokim has a real impact on our sugya. As we saw. So at the end of the day, Chazal give two reasons, and I think they're not mutually exclusive, as to what we're worried about. On the one hand, the interpretation that means this person cursed God, and that's why they got punished. And anytime you see them on the tree, you're reminded of the fact that someone cursed God. That's one interpretation. And then the other interpretation is the Tzelem Elokim interpretation. Anytime someone's hanging, that's a denigration of God, because we are all in the image of God, whether that means physical image or whether that means intellectual image. And that's denigration of God to keep the body up, so you take it down right away. Both of these seem to be applicable, and as we saw, the Tzelem Elokim idea leads us to limit this din in all sorts of ways. Maybe that's part of why it only applies to men and not women. Maybe that's part of why it only applies to a couple of specific averos, but not the others. Maybe that's why you put it up only for a split second, take it down immediately. And certainly it seems to be the basis of the mitzvah of Kfura, both a negative and the positive commandment not to leave a body overnight and to bury it, seems to be tied to the nature of the divine image, that we want God's image to not be left overnight. Very powerful idea. One final point on this issue that complicates things a little bit. We saw Rashi pointed out that there's sort of two levels of Tzelem Elokim. There's all of humanity being in the divine image, and then there's Yisrael Heim Bana. The Jewish people are God's children in some sense, and that's why there's a greater sense of being in the divine image, it would seem, for that reason. So let's ask now the following question: is there a mitzvah to bury non-Jews or not? Right. So, So this is going to be a good test of Rashi's principle, right? To what extent that Tzelem Elokim carries over fully or at least partially in this context. So if we look, we have to look at a totally different Gemara in Gittin. And again, I didn't include this here, but if you look like Sanhedrin from Daf Mem Vav to Mem Ches Mem Tes, there's a good 3 block all about the mitzvah of burial. Worth studying on your own time. But for our purposes, we don't have time for that. But we're going to look at a Gemara in Gittin. Tan Rabbanan Mefarnesin Aniyei Nachrim Im Aniyei Yisrael. We provide for poor Gentiles along with poor Jews. We bury, umivakrim, I misread, we visit sick who are Gentiles along with sick who are Jews. And we bury Gentile deceased along with Jewish deceased for reasons of the ways of peace. We want to have good relationships. We want mutual respect. And so whatever we would do for the Jewish poor, sick, and dead, we do the same thing for non-Jews. Rashi points out, in Mesa Yisrael, Israel, generally Jewish burial places should be separate from non-Jewish burial places to separate for reasons of separation. I was asking about, we take care of them, of their bodies in Mitzvah, Harugim im Yisrael. If they're found killed along with Jews, you bury all the bodies, Jewish and non-Jewish. And now, and the Shulchan Aruch passes this as well, source 14, so the tricky thing here is, on the one hand, we say that we do bury Gentiles. Again, if they have no one to provide for them, right? If their family is going to bury them, then great. If they don't have family to bury them, right, Jews would go ahead and bury Gentiles. But the reason is Darkei Shalom. It's for reasons of peace. It doesn't give the reason of Tselem Elokim, which is interesting. And maybe this is an extension of Rashi's point, that they're sort of, and we've seen this in other places, there may be two different levels. There may be all humans are in the divine image, and certainly for things like, we saw this previously, the prohibition of murder, right? It's prohibited to murder people because all people are in the divine image. That would seem to apply to all humans, and it's prohibited to kill non-Jews for that reason, just like any murder is prohibited for that reason. But maybe certain additional things here, burial where the person's already dead. So maybe any person's Tselem Elokim is decreased after death, at least on some views. Maybe in that case, the reason for burial is not the Tselem Elokim reason. Maybe it's only the Darkei Shalom reason. So there's a bit of a tension here, and it doesn't seem like it applies fully. Even though Rashi said Tselem Elokim applies to all people, but maybe there's an additional level that's required here for the mitzvah of burial to kick in that applies to Jews but not to non-Jews. And we'll address that in a couple of minutes when we look at some of Rabbi Sax's teachings. Before we jump into that, any questions on this whole section about the mitzvah of burial and the interpreting this pasuk of Baal Talin, of not leaving a body overnight, and how this all plays out? Let's see. Okay, one person pointed out, why should Hashem feel pain for a Rasha, right? And yet we do have this idea that we do feel pain for the Rasha, as the Gemara pointed out, an important idea. Another point about women not doing it because of tznius. Yes, that is one of the reasons, but of course, tznius also speaks to the divine image as well. So it may be connected as well. It's hard to disambiguate those 2 points. Any other questions or thoughts before we jump in to the Rabbi Sachs piece of this shir? Okay, so let's jump in, and again, I should just say I was very saddened to hear last night of Rabbi Sax's passing, and he did so much for the Jewish community, and both the communities themselves and for Torah study, and in so many different ways in Jewish thought. And the least we can do is, in a small tribute to him, talk a little bit about his own teachings on Tselem Elokim, and it may be particularly fitting today. I believe is his levaya, is his burial. So while we're talking about the mitzvah of burial, we're also going to talk about some of his understandings of Tselem Elokim as a way of honoring him and his teachings. So first of all, I should just say Tselem Elokim, the divine image, all humans being the divine image. This is a very important theme throughout Rabbi Sax's writings. I only brought quotations from 3 of his volumes, but I'm sure I could bring from probably a dozen more placed in his writing. It's really a central theme. One of Rabbi Sax's main approaches in general was to take Jewish particularist ideas and broaden them and use them to understand more broadly universalistic conceptions, or tie them in to ideas that affect all of humanity. Tselem Elokim is obviously a very good way of doing that, right? As we've seen, at least on some approaches, and this we'll get to. But Tselem Elokim is talking about how all of humanity is created in the divine image, but that's a Jewish idea. That idea comes from the Torah. And so I think what we've seen over the last 3-4 weeks is there's really two different approaches to Tzelem Elokim. Some have a more narrow approach. They narrow it. Maybe it's only Adam and a couple of other family members. Maybe it's only the Jewish people. Maybe it's only men. And then there's a much broader, you might call it universalistic strain of Tzelem Elokim that sees it. No, it's all of humanity. Adam means all of humanity. We saw that in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin. That's why Adam was created alone. One of the reasons is to, and every image of every person is slightly different. We all come from one place. We all have a unique nature, but we all connect back to God. Right? And Chaviv Adam Shenibar B'Tzelem, so many sources indicate this very broad idea of all of humanity being in the divine image, man or woman, whatever one's religion, race, age, whatnot, everything that doesn't matter, we're all in the divine image. And Rabbi Sachs, throughout his writings, takes this broad universalist view of Tzelem Elokim. I think generally that seems to be that, at least among the Torah scholars I've been exposed to, that seems to be the main view nowadays. Although, again, we've seen conceptions that diverge from that, but that seems to be the primary approach, the derech hamelech, so to speak, that people take, and Rabbi Sachs among them. So let's just quickly skim. We don't have time to do this justice, but we'll at least try to examine some of his approach here. Source number 15. I believe globalization is summoning the world's great faiths to the supreme challenge. Can we find in the human thou a fragment of the divine thou? Can we recognize God's image in one who is not in my image? And the challenge of Tzelem Elokim is not just to say, oh yeah, everyone's in God's image. It's precisely this question of the universalism. Be able to say Tzelem Elokim is not just for Jews, it's for all people. I can recognize that in all people. And I, a Jew, recognize God's image in one who is not in my image, in a Hindu or Sikh or Christian or Muslim or an Eskimo from Greenland speaking about a melting glacier. Can I do so and feel not diminished but enlarged? I think this idea that we're all in the divine image, that doesn't mean that I'm less in the divine image. It just means that my conception of divine image has now broadened in that universalistic way, coming from a place of particularism, of our tradition, and seeing it as a way of including everyone. And again, this is in Dignity of Difference as well. Perhaps the most influential single phrase in Western civilization is the verse in the first chapter of Genesis, Let's make man in our image and likeness. What's revolutionary is not that a human being can be in the image of God. In other cultures in the ancient world, kings and pharaohs were gods or representative of gods. What's new is not that a human being can be in the image of God, but that every human being is. From its inception, Judaism was a living protest against hierarchical societies that give some, but not all, dignity. Again, this idea of the broad Tzelem Elokim applying to everyone, not just the great leaders, not just some, that's a central idea. And then a similar point here, he says this also, it would take some time, but this is also the basis of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's not self-evident, right? They take it to be self-evident, but that's the opposite of the view throughout much of history that people are not equal. What the Torah recognized early on, says Rabbi Sachs, it took thousands of years until the Declaration of Independence and similar movements of that time recognized as well. So again, it's this very important idea that Tzelem Elokim is not about some people, it's about all people. It's a universalistic reading that's really essential for Rabbi Sachs in appreciating what the Tzelem Elokim is about. Okay, and now here in this is in Not in God's Name, which is about opposition to religious violence. We'll see an angle of Tzelem Elokim that we've seen in previous classes. He writes, by making the human person in his image, God has given us freedom, the freedom to do good, which necessarily entails the freedom to do evil. And that's the story of Bereshis, God's pain and disappointment in Adam and Chava, in Cain, in the generation of the flood. They used their freedom to bring chaos. Yet there is never a hint that God might create Homo sapiens without freedom, right? Free God desires the free worship of free human beings. This idea that all human beings have to be free for this to work. And that's his idea of Tzelem Elokim, right? And we saw this, I think, the first week. This idea that Tzelem Elokim, part of Tzelem Elokim, it's not just the soul, it's not just one's appearance, it's not just one's intellect, it's free will as it connects to those things. The idea of free will is essential to the divine image. Rabbi Sachs makes that point as well, and that's why God sticks with the world as it is, despite all the failings. Bereshis is a story of a lot of failings, and yet God doesn't change humanity. We remain in our free-willed, imperfect image. Okay, and now another sort of twist on this is that the image of God is juxtaposed to the biblical idea that God has no image. Right? It's sort of a paradox. Humans are in the image of God, but God has no image. We dealt with this a few weeks ago, right? How can it be? Everyone said, how can it be humans are in the image of God if God doesn't have an image? God transcends categorization. Were you to have an image, you would be this, not that. But that's not what we say. And then he quotes the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, we just mentioned a few minutes ago. For this reason, Nivra Adam Yechidi, man was created alone to teach whoever destroys a single life is as if he destroyed a complete universe. For the sake of peace, no one should say, my Father is greater than yours. To proclaim the greatness of the Holy One, that a human makes many coins from one mold, they're all the same. The Supreme King of Kings makes every human being in the same image, yet all are different. God resists categorization, and so does humanity. Right? Humankind is also not one thing. We're many things, but we're all in the divine image. And then you move from that to Parshas Noach. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, because in the image of God, God made man. It sounds like it's the same as gracious, but it's not. Here it's not talking about how we, all of us, are in God's image. It's talking about how everyone else is in God's image. Again, this is part of the idea of universalizing, of applying broadly this idea of Tselem Elokim, and right, a way of ensuring that violence doesn't happen like it did before the flood, but that we make sure to take this seriously, that everyone's in God's image and to treat others like that. Moving forward, and now to a more recent parsha. God cares about the stranger, so must we. Avram invites 3 strangers into the tent. Right? This is yesterday's parsha. And they're angels. Yaakov wrestles with the unnamed adversary, says he sees God face to face. Welcoming the stranger, say Chazal, is greater than receiving the divine presence. Right? So, and then he quotes the same Mishnah in Sanhedrin. We all are made in different images, but all of us are representative of the divine image. And that means, again, the idea of accepting the outsider, accepting the stranger, welcoming people in, that's essential to applying the idea of Tselem Elokim. It's not just that we are all special. It's not just that we shouldn't kill others. It's that we need to bring in others and treat them with that special status of Tselem Elokim that we all deserve. Now, what was the impact of this on Western thought? According to Rabbi Sachs, the biblical idea that we're each in the image and likeness of God actually was channeled by Kant. That's Kant's principle as well. Treat human beings as ends, not means. Kant's kingdom of ends. They think there's nothing unconditionally good except for goodwill. The only thing that's good is goodwill, and we need to have that goodwill towards others. Even though Kant himself rejects the idea that we can be commanded in these things, he accepts the conclusion. He accepts the idea that we need to treat other people well as ends in themselves, as having inherent value. For Kant, that inherent value was not being in the image of God. It was just treating other people well. But at the end of the day, he got to the same point that Bracious got to. And this again, Rabbi Sachs likes talking about Western thought and Jewish thought and how they mix and how they work together, and often how Judaism got it right first. This is a classic example of that point in his thought. And now we'll just look at one quick passage at in the conclusion, the dignity of difference. He says he's argued that we want to find an idea equal to the challenge of our time, right? Our world of globalization, we all can see everyone else, but we're all different than everyone else. What's the idea that we need to respond to this? And he says the idea is one God, creator of diversity, commands us to honor his creation by respecting diversity. God, the maker of all, set his image on the person as such, prior to our varied cultures and civilizations, conferring on human life a dignity and sanctity that transcends our differences. That's the covenant with Noah, this idea of universal human rights. That's the covenant with Avram and the path to salvation. All righteous people of all nations have a share in the world to come. That I think he's channeling the Rambam there. Until the great faiths not merely tolerate but find positive value in diversity, we will have wars. So we need to be able to value others, even those who are very different than ourselves. And the test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who's not in my image, whose language, faith, ideals are different than mine? If I can't, then I've made God in my image instead of allowing him to remake me in his. Our goal shouldn't be to project ourselves onto God, but to allow God to be projected onto us and onto everyone else, to realize that God exists in all humanity, and not take that particularist view and say, well, we're in God's image and not others. No, it's to say we need to extend that to everyone. Talks about different areas where there's clashes, where there's conflict. And he says, can we create a paradigm shift where we can recognize that we're enlarged, not diminished by difference? Just like we're enlarged by the multiple languages, each with its unique sensibilities, art forms, and literary expressions. It's not about cosmopolitanism of being nowhere, but being rooted where we are and yet seeing value in others. And I think this teaching, maybe more than any other teaching of Tselem Elokim, how we should be proud of who we are, proud of our tradition that says that we're in God's image, but also recognizes that means that everyone else is also in God's image, to treat them well, not just surmei ran, not just to avoid things like murder, but also chesed, to treat others well across the board. And that, I think, is one of Rabbi Sacks's core teachings, this idea of Tselem Elokim, treating everyone as if they have infinite value. It looks like we have some questions, but yes, let's take some questions quickly. Okay, right, there's a challenge of having pity on the evil. Sometimes is unkind to good people. It's a fair challenge. I think God doesn't face that challenge. God is infinitely good and doesn't need to worry about being too kind to those who don't deserve it. God can figure out the justice and sort that out. But there is still this idea of everyone has some basic dignity, even though maybe in extreme cases people can forfeit it, but everyone has this Tselem Elokim, at least to start, and we need to treat everyone with the dignity of difference. Okay, Judy, it looks like you raised your hand. Okay, so you asked, someone told me yesterday, my friend said, there's a tzura of everyone, a form of everyone in Shemayim, in heaven, of their ideal life. Our job in this world is to match that form. Okay, interesting idea. I don't know if that's the same as Tselem Elokim, meaning Tselem Elokim means that humans are in God's image. It sounds like that idea is that we all sort of have an ideal life that we're expected to live out, or at least come close to it, which is not the same idea, but also a very interesting and important idea. Okay, any other questions on either Rabbi Sacks or the beginning part? Okay, if there are no other questions, we can we're just about at time. I guess I just should say it's been a pleasure learning with all of you, and both those who were here this week and those who were here the previous 3 sessions. I think we managed to talk about what is Tselem Elokim and issues of Jew versus non-Jew, whether it applies broadly or not. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, and also today in Rabbi Sacks it came up. We talked about issues of gender, how Tselem Elokim applies itself to men and to women. And then today we talked about the mitzvah of burial, and in some ways summed up or took one contemporary view that very much takes the universalist view, the broadest application of Tselem Elokim, namely that of Rabbi Sacks. Hopefully this is a tribute to him. Next month, there's going to be a whole bunch of new classes from Drisha, one of which is going to be at this same time slot, Sunday, 1 to 2, New York time, by Rabbi Sam Liebens, Dr. Sam Liebens, who's I think actually a student of Rabbi Sacks. He's going to be talking about the Tselem Elokim more in philosophical perspective. This is more focused on Chazal, so everyone's encouraged to study that. And more generally, we're all encouraged to reflect on our shared humanity, our Tselem Elokim. Maybe treat, if we look at everyone else, every other human, as we look at God, maybe we'd find that we treated everyone else a little bit better. So everyone, with that bracha, everyone should try to apply that to their lives and try to enrich their lives by seeing God's face, as it were, God's image in everyone else. And everyone should continue their learning generally as well.
Thank you, Rabbi Zuckier, for an interesting class series. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We are going to continue our fall program tomorrow at 1 p.m. with the 5th part of a series by Dr. Shana Strauchik on the laws of kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations. In addition, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes or watch live at www.drisha.org live. Thank you again, Dr. Zuckier, for this opportunity to learn with you. And for everyone who attended, we hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes at Drisha. Have a wonderful week.